One thing I've learned when it comes to Fujimoto is that his fans are crazy.
Who here is a Makima fan?
As you can see, they can be complete and utter weirdos, but that could just be the result of Fujimoto also being crazy. But Fujimoto has shown us more than once that he isn't just crazy, he's kind of a genius. He's able to write a great story, and that is shown just by how much people like Chainsaw Man and Fire Punch and Goodbye Eri and Look Back. You get the point. But he's also been showing this with his most recent installment of Chainsaw Man Part 2. When it comes to comparing two different series, it is really easy because they are different stories. But comparing the same story to it itself sounds really stupid, especially when I say it out loud. But without Fujimoto has released Chainsaw Man, comparing the two parts has become something that a lot of people have been doing. So how does Chainsaw Man Part 2 stack up to Part 1? Asa Mitaka is one of the most important characters in Part 2. She's a very socially awkward girl, and with how she seems to mess up at every corner of her life, she gets discouraged very easily. With Part 1, the limelight was put on Denji, and it's no secret his life has been very crappy. Part 2, however, Asa has been put into that same limelight, and it's through seeing things through her perspective that the story has felt like it's just felt like way more of a slow burn. Especially reading it week to week, it definitely felt like Fujimoto was taking his time with Part 2. But because it has felt slower than Part 1, one of Fujimoto's strengths as an author has really been put on display, and that's his ability to write human emotions and relatable characters. We already knew he could do this with Part 1, but Part 2, in my opinion, has been doing it a little better. Fujimoto clearly has been taking his time with Part 2 and has laid some very strong foundations with the direction he's heading in. Despite feeling a bit slower than Part 1, Part 2 has become just as extreme as Part 1 was, and with the most recent chapters, maybe even more. So the two main reasons why Part 1 and 2 are looked at differently are definitely the change in perspective from Denji to Asa, but also how the parts have been released. It wasn't just one seamless, continuous transition. At least for a while, only following Asa, it made things feel like a completely different story when Part 2 was first coming out. Now, if we kept following Denji, I feel like the story would have progressed more akin to the breakneck speed we were used to with Part 1. Heck, now that the focus has started to focus a bit more on Denji again, things are going back to that extremeness we saw with the pacing. And I think that's actually a really important thing to look at with Chainsaw Man right now. I think Part 2 is definitely gonna get even crazier than Part 1, and I think we're already seeing that now. But now with Part 2, we're not dealing with some very out-of-pocket, nothing to lose teenage boy anymore, but instead something worse. A teenage girl. Wait. I'm joking. No, but seriously, we get to see a character that seems to take a lot of things more seriously around her, which is a massive turning point for Chainsaw Man. Asa is a really big side of Part 2. It was a really big leap of faith to continue Chainsaw Man with how he did with following Asa around for, like the first 30 chapters, 25, somewhere around there. So instead of seeing some fearless, almost immortal guy, we get to see this very socially awkward and almost just kind of sad person at first. I mentioned this in a video I made on Asa a while back, but whenever she believes in herself, she does some great things. She's very capable, but the problem with that is that even though she has the war devil kind of on her side, she doesn't always have the courage to act on what she is capable of, which again plays to Fujimoto's strength of writing very realistic characters and really just very relatable characters. It's been such a big contrast from going from Denji, who was, just jumping wall to wall, high energy, not really caring about much, and then going to Asa, who does things a lot differently. But she is still able to do things like defeat the Eternity Devil with some very clever thinking, and Fujimoto has made it a point with Asa that she searches for validation, especially in the beginning. And that's why after the accident at the start she has with the Chicken Devil Bucky, she tosses and turns over it. Now there are some things that happen to Asa that make her whole situation super extreme, but we see with Denji that when she goes on a date with him, Asa does find some sort of validation. Again, the only thing Asa needs is to believe in herself, to have confidence. She doesn't really need validation, but that sort of thing does help her gain confidence. And that's why Denji has become such an important character to Asa after the aquarium date, and with what we've been seeing lately. So in one part of the story, you have a teenage girl who struggles with self-esteem issues and has very low confidence in herself. But what happens when you compare that to part 1? Denji was even younger when his life got teared up into shreds. Even before that, it didn't even seem like he had a decent life with the parents he had, and there's definitely some trauma that, you know, I feel like Fujimoto's going to explore. Still, it changed the way he grew as a person. It stunted him so much that instead of growing to become a fully functional person, he could really only truly care about his physical needs most of the time. And that's really all he could care about before becoming Chainsaw Man. Which, this isn't just some fictional thing, it's something a psychologist came up with called Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where your basic needs like food, water are at the bottom, and then you go up to more social things. Which, alright, I'm bringing out the very nerdy stuff or whatever, but just stick with me for a sec. Asa, she found love and belonging a long time ago. She struggles with self-esteem issues, so you can see where she's at as a person. Denji, since the start, has been struggling with his most basic physiological needs or physical needs, but once he becomes Chainsaw Man, he meets those like safety, basic human needs, and eventually he finds a sense of love and family with Power and Aki, a sense of connection. But in part 2, he knows to not let people walk all over him, but he still struggles with finding a sense of connection, finding a family, having intimacy, which he does have with Nayuta, but ooh. The main reason I'm liking part 2 versus part 1 is because part 2 has really turned into something very alluring to me, somewhat relatable in a very human sense, very weird sense too, because Chainsaw Man is just so crazy. But I guess it's just how realistic the characters feel in certain ways. But it's also what Fujimoto has in store for us that excites me the most. I got into Chainsaw Man Part 1 after things ended, so finally being able to witness the chapters week to week, it's been one of the most fun experiences I've had in a while. I've really liked the weekly reading experience, and man, just when I thought I figured things out with Fujimoto, it just turns in a completely different direction. I don't think it's Fujimoto's goal to try to compare who has lived the worst life out of Asa and Denji, or who has had bigger trauma out of these two, but instead to tell a story about how even though their lives are super crappy, they can still find reasons to keep going. But we have started to see Denji's point of view on things. We get to see how he's been living with Nayuta, a little bit of school life, and a whole bunch of his situation with being Chainsaw Man. And again, definitely with the introduction of Asa, things do feel like a new story. But without things have been unraveling up to the most recent chapters, I'm starting to see the same Chainsaw Man again that we got in part 1. But here, with the Nostradamus prophecy, the Death Devil, the 4 Horsemen of the Apocalypse, Denji turn into the armored Chainsaw Man or whatever, the stakes feel so much higher, and things again are starting to just look so crazier than part 1, and I'm all here for it. So I know I was really all over the place. Which one is better? It's really hard to say because part 2 is still ongoing, but at least for me, I've been liking the story part 2 has been telling. Part 1 is obviously the building block of part 2. They're the same story. It introduces us to the world of Chainsaw Man and devils and to Denji. So many things happen in it in such a short period of time that you can't help but call it a very fun read. But it's also very sad. So why am I thinking part 2 is better? I've really just been enjoying that slow burn type of story that part 2 has been telling. There's a very big shift in the atmosphere around Asa compared to Denji. Fujimoto has clearly been building something with part 2, and finally it's really paying off. One of the craziest things is part 1, really most of the characters weren't able to survive alongside Chainsaw Man, because, dude, with what Denji went through, I mean, that's no surprise. But part 2 built up Asa and has turned her into such a great character. She's just one of my favorite characters in general. And I mean, same with Denji. And so seeing these two meeting and interacting, even though things can get very awkward and very sad and very exciting, and just so far together, it's really fun seeing them. So although I'm thinking that part 1 is very close to part 2, I'm definitely liking part 2 just a bit more. But yeah, that's been my 2 cents. It's not very coherent. But yeah, that's all just my own opinion. So I'm gonna turn things over to my friend Lounge Act to see what he has to say about this.
In my head, I often consider Chainsaw Man Part 1 and Part 2 to be completely different stories. I don't think that it's just because they essentially are, both literally and figuratively. Part 2 pacing-wise feels like it moves at slow motion when compared to Part 1. For example, remember the Bomb Girl arc? One of, if not the most pivotal moments in the entirety of Chainsaw Man that really showed what Fujimoto was capable of as a storyteller? Well, it started on chapter 39 of Part 1 and ended just 13 later on chapter 52. That's it. That's all it took for Fujimoto to set up Reize and Denji's relationship and completely tear it down without remorse. He didn't stop there, as the longest arc in Part 1, the International Assassination arc, was only 17 chapters long. Now let's look at Part 2, which so far has arcs like the Chainsaw Man Church arc, that is a whopping 24 chapters, or the current arc, which is currently 20 and counting. Do I sometimes wish we could go back to the old days of breakneck pacing? Well, honestly, yes, more than I would like, but then I remember what type of story Chainsaw Man Part 2 is. The best analogy I have to compare Part 1 and Part 2 are Legos, the perfect analogy for seemingly every YouTube video essay, especially for Chainsaw Man. With Part 1, it feels like Fujimoto built the base of CSM first, so we knew what it was first and foremost, a battle action manga. Then he would slowly build whole new elements on top of said base before tearing it down and building something else completely different. First, he built a love story on top of it. Then, when we expected Chainsaw Man to be that, he tore it all down to build an international political thriller, before tearing that down to finally build God knows what the Gun and Control Devil arcs were, before completely destroying that too along with the base. So now Part 2 feels as if we're starting entirely from scratch, but this time we're slowly building a monstrously complex and detailed set. One that requires a very well-defined base in order to bloom into something spectacular. Like those $700 Star Wars ones that grown men buy for their quote-unquote children. Unfortunately, we are still in the process of seeing Chainsaw Man being built. And sometimes it can be boring, but other times it can bring the series to bigger and greater heights than before. I don't think that until Part 2 is finished will all the pieces finally click together. Frankly, reading Part 2 week to week versus all at once is a very different experience. I implore those of you who haven't taken the time to start again from chapter 98 to just do that and reread from then on up. I think you'll come out with a brand new appreciation for Chainsaw Man Part 2 just like I did. Though as I mentioned earlier, we aren't done yet when it comes to talking about Part 2's differences to Part 1, since they both feel extremely different to one another in terms of just overall vibes, I guess you could say nowadays. I remember the dichotomy when Part 2 had just started its serialization around the same time that the anime began airing. It was strange watching so much hype around Part 1 from a more casual anime perspective, while diehard CSM fans couldn't get enough of Part 2. It genuinely felt like two different series at the same time, especially since it would be a minute before Denji would properly get introduced into Part 2. Though nowadays things have evened out. Most of the more casual fans became die-hard ones after reading the manga once the anime finished airing, so balance has been restored. But why do I consider them community-wise to be different? Well, probably because I just associate different eras of Chainsaw Man with different eras of my life as well. I mean, it was one of my first ever manga. I would go so far as to say that it made me realize that media in general can connect with me on such a deep level in the first place. I think it's safe to say Chainsaw Man is my favorite thing, period, at this point, since I can't really imagine my life without it. Not because it dramatically affected it in any way, I mean, it definitely has, but this series just feels so synonymous with me for some reason. It's like one of the 4 constants in life: birth, death, taxes, and Chainsaw Man. That being said, I genuinely don't know what I'll do when the series ends, because sadly, I think that reality may be coming sooner than we would like to accept. Fujimoto doesn't really like to stick to one thing. Even when it comes to the same series, he refuses to keep his writing style straight. He's also stated in the past that he would like to stop drawing manga and instead switch to just writing stories, letting someone else hold the pen, which I think would be a real shame since we would be losing one of the most unique artists in the industry, but still I'll buy whatever has Fujimoto's name on it. Though deep down, part of me does want a Chainsaw Man Part 2, Part 4, Part 5, etc, etc. I mean, why wouldn't I want my favorite series ever to keep going? That's honestly what all of us hoped the reality was going to be when Part 2 was first announced. I thought each part we would have gotten to face off against a different horseman, and then we would have gotten one big final part where Denji kills the Devil or something crazy like that. But thinking back on it, I have no idea why I thought that other than pure copium, because deep down, I always knew Chainsaw Man wasn't that type of story. And I wouldn't have it any other way, frankly, since this is the story I fell in love with. Sadly, that just makes it the more heartbreaking, knowing that Chainsaw Man is probably going to end with Part 2, as realistically, how could a Part 3 even happen at this point in the series? Though I genuinely have no idea how much longer Part 2 will last, as my predictions have never landed, not once. So I may be wrong with every single word I've said here. Something else just as unpredictable is trying to understand how Part 2 will conclude story-wise. All I know is there will probably be a possibility that none of us have thought of, and a possibility that I can't wait to see. Thank you all for listening to what I had to say. My name is LoungeAct. See you guys another time.
First off, I want to say thank you to LoungeAct for working with me on this video. He's a very busy guy, at least it seems like, so I appreciate that he helped me out. If you want to go check his channel out, I'll leave a link in the description for you. Second off, I'm sorry if this whole video came off as one big schizo rant, but I've been neglecting talking about Chainsaw Man for a while, so I just wanted to include a whole bunch of stuff just jam-packed into this video. Chainsaw Man is something I want to take a look at every now and then, especially when there are super crazy chapters like what we've gotten recently with Nayuta and the return of some characters and new character. Oh my god, it's just been crazy. Where will the most recent events of Chainsaw Man lead us? I have no clue, but I'm here for the ride. Seriously, I'm gonna try if anything happens to Denji. But thanks for watching, and see ya in the next video. Peace.
Little Japanese girls scurry to me like rats. They don't even want a suit from me. They just want to be violated by me. How old are you? 18. Say it again. 18. Plenty of consent here. Zoom in. Look at this. Pick, pick, pick. Open mouth fish lapel. Beautiful. Handcrafted signature buttons. A beautiful slanted breast pocket and these beautiful slanted side pockets. Open it up. Open up the present. Perfectly gift wrapped. Look at this perfectly, beautifully gift.
One thing I've learned when it comes to Tatsuki food. One thing I've learned when it comes to Tatsuki Fujimoto